A is for apple. It's red and green. B is for ball. It bounces between. C is for chaining. Hi, I'm Dr. Igor Yurichevich, and this is Functional Analysis of Behavior 1. Let's go. Okay, so today we're going to introduce the concept of behavior chains. And behavior chains are a very important concept in applied behavior analysis because it is one of the things that allows us to do very complicated behaviors that are made up of multiple individual behaviors. So a behavior chain is made up of multiple individual behavior links. And today we're going to dive into that idea to see how powerful it is and to see how we can use it in applied behavior analysis, in functional analysis of behavior. So Cooper, Heron, and Heward, they defined a behavior chain as a linked sequence of responses leading to a terminal outcome. Each response produces a stimulus change that functions as a conditioned reinforcement for the response and a discriminative stimulus for the next response in the chain. So we are going to unpack that idea of a behavior chain presented here in that definition. And we're going to do it with a rather typical example, and that is learning the complicated behaviors that you would need to learn if you decided to become a superhero. So yeah, we are going a little bit extreme. We are going a little bit in my wheelhouse here, but I like to sometimes use these out of the world, ludicrous examples because they really drive home the idea and they're memorable, and we're just going to lean into it. And bottom line, I like superheroes. So let's go on this journey. Come along with me. All right. So let's say that you were training to be a superhero and you were trying to learn the behavior chain or the behavior of stopping a getaway car full of dastardly villains. So the behavior you're trying to learn is to stop that car that's trying to get away. It's full of bad guys, and you need to perform multiple behaviors in order to perform this behavior successfully. So if you wanted to stop a getaway car full of dastardly evildoers, first thing you need to do is you need to jump in front of that car. Second thing you need to do is you need to put your hands on the car in order to stop its forward momentum. Third step, you need to rip off the hood of the car. Fourth step, you need to put your hands on the engine of the car. And then finally, that fifth step, you need to rip that engine out, immobilizing the car and successfully performing the behavior of stopping that getaway vehicle full of dastardly villains. So this is an example of a behavior chain. And in this example, we have the linked sequences of responses. So each of these responses has to be done in a sequence. It has to be done in order. So you can't skip to behavior number 2, stopping the car, until you've done behavior number 1, jumping in front. And then we have the terminal behavior, or the terminal outcome, which is ripping the engine out of the car. And that is when you have successfully completed the entire behavior chain. So let's take a look at how these behavior chains function. So we mentioned that each response produces a stimulus change that then functions as a conditioned reinforcement for that response and a discriminative stimulus for the next response in the chain. So what do we mean by this? Well, basically, what we mean is that when you break this down, this behavior chain, into its component behavior links, we have that first behavior of jumping in front of the car. When that first behavior occurs, you get reinforced. You get reinforced for performing the behavior, but importantly, that behavior of jumping in front of the car produces a stimulus change. And that stimulus change is a discriminative stimulus that indicates that the next behavior can now be performed. So what is that stimulus change? Well, that is a change in your environment that basically tells you you are now in front of the car. So before you were not in front of the car, now you are in front of the car. That is a stimulus change, a change in your location in the environment. And being in front of the car serves as a discriminative stimulus that now indicates that if you place your hands on the car, you will be reinforced for that behavior. So once that discriminative stimulus is present, you now know that you will be reinforced if you place your hands on the car, and then stopping the car becomes that discriminative stimulus for the next behavior in the chain, which is ripping the hood off. So once you produce the stimulus change when you've stopped that car, that stimulus change indicates it's a discriminative stimulus that the next behavior can now be performed, will now be reinforced. So you rip the hood off of the car, that behavior gets reinforced. That produces a stimulus change. For example, now you can see the engine, and that stimulus change acts as a discriminative stimulus to tell you that the next behavior will now be reinforced, putting your hands on the engine. And then when you perform that behavior, get reinforced, it produces a discriminative stimulus. Your hands are now on the engine, indicating that you can now perform the behavior and get reinforced for ripping the engine out of the car. And then that is your terminal response. And once you produce that, you get reinforced, and the entire behavior chain has been successfully performed. So we were talking about getting reinforced and discriminative stimuli, but importantly, a lot of the power of the behavior chain lies in the fact that that discriminative stimulus becomes a conditioned reinforcer for each behavior step. So that is where a lot of the power of the behavior chain occurs. So let's take a look at how that happens in this process. So you'll notice that when you jump in front of the car, that becomes a discriminative stimulus to perform the second behavior, the next behavior. But when you jump in front of the car, let's say that we were training somebody on this behavior, and we're going to talk about training. There's a lot of things to consider in behavior chain training. We're going to do that in the next video. But let's say that you were training somebody to jump in front of the car. They jump in front of the car. They are now in front of the car. That is that discriminative stimulus. That is that stimulus change. And now you reinforce them. You maybe give them an edible reinforcer. You maybe give them some social reinforcement. You say, way to go, good job. And then you perform the next behavior, and then so on along the chain. But notice what happened right here. Right here, we have the discriminative stimulus of being in front of the car, and that was followed very closely in time by a reinforcer. And what happens is that after a large number of trials, or a certain number of trials, doesn't have to be large, but after a number of trials where that discriminative stimulus is paired with a reinforcer over and over and over again, through classical conditioning, that discriminative stimulus becomes a conditioned reinforcer. And now it can act as reinforcement for the behavior of jumping in front of the car without actually presenting a primary reinforcer, like an edible reinforcer or social reinforcement. And notice that this pairing happens at every single stage of this behavior chain. So at every single stage, the person performing the behavior gets reinforced after the stimulus, the discriminative stimulus occurs, and that pairing of that primary reinforcer and the discriminative stimulus allows the discriminative stimulus to acquire this conditioned reinforcement properties. And that means that later on in the learning procedure, that discriminative stimulus can act as a reinforcer for that behavior without a primary reinforcer being present. So that's a very powerful outcome, that the act of the behavior itself in the chain can now serve as reinforcement for that particular behavior. All right, so we'll take a look at how to break up this behavior chain into these component parts. So we need to, if we're going to teach a behavior chain, one of the first steps that we need to do is we need to break up that chain into its little behavior links. We need to break it up into its step-by-step procedure. So if we were teaching this superhero how to stop a runaway car or a getaway car full of dastardly evildoers, we would need to break it up into step 1. Jump in front of the car. Step 2, put your hands on the car. Step 3, rip off the hood. Step 4, put your hands on the engine. Step 5, rip that engine out. And the way that we do that is by conducting a task analysis. So Cooper, Heron, and Heward mentioned that a task analysis involves breaking a complex task into smaller teachable units, the product of which is a series of sequentially ordered steps or tasks. So before we get into how to do this, let's just acknowledge that all of us have been the victim of poor task analysis. All of us have gone to a manual, gone to a step-by-step guide, and realized pretty quickly that that step-by-step guide is not very helpful, which means that that task analysis was not done right. So we've all been the victims of task analyses not done correctly. So for example, if you want to learn how to draw an owl, this task analysis is not going to be helpful. It's not going to be an effective task analysis. And if you're trying to draw a rose, you might find this task analysis says step 1, draw a lettuce. Step 2, paint it in red. And you might think to yourself, well, you know what? I'm halfway there. Now I just need a task analysis for how to draw a lettuce. So you do an online search and you find out, yeah, the way to draw a lettuce is to step 1, draw rows. Step 2, paint it in green. These are very poor task analyses, and this is what we want to avoid. We do not want to make a poor, ineffective breakup of that behavior chain, because then it will not be productive. It will not be effective in teaching that behavior chain and allowing the learner to learn. So those are some examples of bad behavior chains. Let's take an example, look at a few good behavior chains, task analyses of behavior chains. So here we have one, a 10-step procedure for putting on pants. And this might be used to teach a child to put on pants, or to teach people with special needs how to put on pants. And we have this one here, another example of a task analysis for how to wash hands. Here's a more complicated version of a task analysis. This one is to help somebody learn the behavior chain of getting dressed. And what I like about this one is that it also allows you to record what are the response prompts that you needed to use for each step in the task analysis. And that idea of response prompts is going to come up next video when we talk about training training the behavior chain. But as you can see, a task analysis, to put it together, can be quite complex. So here's a 17-step task analysis for brushing teeth. Here is a 9-step task analysis for shaving your face. And then here is an example of a 7-step task analysis for tying shoes. So how do you come up with these task analyses? Let's take an example. Let's say that you were given the assignment of coming up with a task analysis to teach somebody how to wash their hands. So how would you go about putting this together? Well, there's a number of different procedures that you can use. The first procedure we're going to talk about is watching a competent person perform that behavior. So if you were trying to come up with a task analysis for how to wash hands, your first step might be, well, let's observe somebody who knows how to wash hands. So you might say, hey, you know what? Doctors know how to wash hands. I'm just going to observe a doctor. And then you make a note of the steps that that particular person takes in order to wash your hands. So that is method number 1. Watch a competent person perform that particular behavior chain. Procedure number 2, or method number 2 that you can use, is you can perform the task yourself. So if you needed to come up with a step-by-step procedure for washing hands, you could go wash your own hands and take a look at the steps that you do along that behavior chain. So that is method number 2. Method number 3 is to consult an expert. So we all did this in the recent lockdown when the CDC would put out guides on how to effectively wash your hands. And what these guides were, these were task analyses. So when the CDC put out this 5-step behavior chain for washing your hands, that was a task analysis. And if you needed to create a task analysis, you could consult an expert like the CDC and come up with that task analysis. And then finally, sometimes you just need to use the 4th method, which is trial and error. And this is oftentimes used when you have a novel situation. So let's say that you were interested in teaching people to wash their hands in an area where there wasn't readily available running water, right? So let's say that you did not have the ability, or they did not have the ability, they did not have the resources to actually go and use a faucet, actually go and use running water. What were you going to do? How could you figure out that particular task analysis? Well, one thing that you can do is use the 4th method, which is trial and error. So you might find out that they do have a water source. It's just not readily available, and they can't spend time near that water source, but they can take water away from that water source, right? So they can collect the water and bring it back to wherever they live. So you might say to yourself, all right, step number 1, go collect the water in a washing machine. And you might say to yourself, well, wait a second, washing machine, we tried it out. It's too big. Nobody can carry something that heavy back to their homes. So washing machine, fill a washing machine as step number 1 in your task analyses. That was a trial, turned out to be an error. So you would move on to the next possibility, which is filling up a glass. Now, the glass will be much easier to carry, but it might be unstable. It might not give you enough water in order to wash your hands. So here we have another trial. Here we have another error, and you would try again. And you might say, hey, maybe a bucket. Maybe they take the bucket to the water source and then bring that back. to their home, and you would go through this procedure of just trying things, seeing if they work, and if they don't, trying another thing, seeing if it works, until you come up with an effective solution and you come up with your task analysis of that behavior chain. All right, so that is it for today's video. So in today's video, we introduced the idea of behavior chains, and we introduced the idea of task analyses, and we took a look at some really bad task analyses of behavior chains. We took a look at some effective task analyses of behavior chains. And then we talked about the 4 methods that you can use to produce a task analysis, and that is observe a competent person perform the behavior, do the behavior yourself, consult an expert, and when all else fails, just do some good old-fashioned trial and error until you get it right. So that is it for what I wanted to cover today. Join us next time when we go back and forth with forward and backward chaining, when we take a look at how to train behavior chains. But until then, thank you so much for joining me. And until I see you next time, stay frosty, stay functional. And I think we are ready to go. All right. Plan 47 is in full effect.